The invitation arrived on cream-colored linen paper, embossed with my parents' names in elegant script. Robert and Patricia Bennett cordially invite you to celebrate 35 years of marriage. Black tie. The Magnolia Room, 7 o'clock sharp. I held it in my hands for a long time, tracing the raised letters with my fingertip, wondering if this might finally be different. Wondering if maybe, just maybe, they actually wanted me there. That hope died the moment I walked through the door, and my mother's face went pale like she'd seen a ghost she thought she'd successfully buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known better. The Bennett family didn't do spontaneous warmth. They did calculated appearances, strategic displays of unity, carefully orchestrated moments designed for maximum social impact. But when that invitation showed up in my mailbox, hand-addressed in my mother's perfect penmanship, something in me cracked open. Something desperate and foolish that still believed family meant something more than a name on a building downtown. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes through Savannah's winding historic streets, past the moss-draped oaks and antebellum homes that tourists photographed like they were looking at something sacred. The Bennett house sat at the end of a private drive, all white columns and manicured hedges, the kind of place that whispered old money so loudly you could hear it from the street. I'd grown up in that house, but I'd never felt like it was home. Home implied warmth, safety, belonging. The Bennett estate was a museum where children were expected to be exhibits, polished and perfect and entirely silent unless spoken to. I parked my 10-year-old Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling the familiar shame creep up my spine. That's what they did best, my family. They made you feel small without saying a word, just by existing in their perfectly curated world where everything had a place and I had never quite figured out what mine was supposed to be. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down the simple black dress I'd bought on sale 3 months ago. It wasn't designer, it wasn't custom-tailored, but it was clean and appropriate, and it was what I could afford on a non-profit salary. The invitation was still in my purse. I touched it one more time, like a talisman, like proof that I hadn't imagined this. Then I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front entrance, heels clicking against the brick pathway that wound through gardens my mother paid someone else to maintain. The November air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of camellia blooms and something else, something that always hung around the Bennett property, like expensive perfume sprayed too liberally. Expectation, maybe, or judgment. I rang the doorbell. Through the frosted glass panels on either side of the massive oak door, I could see movement, shapes shifting in the warm light inside. Laughter drifted out, the kind of easy, relaxed sound that happened when people felt comfortable, when they belonged. I straightened my shoulders and waited. The door opened. My mother stood there in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my monthly rent, diamonds at her throat, her silver hair swept up in an immaculate twist. For just a second, her carefully maintained composure slipped. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, like she was about to say something, then thought better of it. Behind her, I could see into the foyer where at least 20 people milled around with cocktails, all dressed to perfection, all looking like they'd stepped out of a Southern Living spread on how to host the perfect anniversary celebration. "Mom," I said, forcing a smile. "Happy anniversary." Patricia Bennett was many things: a master gardener, a ruthless bridge player, the chairman of half a dozen charity boards. But in that moment, standing in her own doorway looking at her youngest daughter, she was simply uncomfortable. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, and I watched her eyes dart past me, like she was checking to see if anyone else had witnessed this unexpected arrival. "Natalie," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded like an accusation. "What are you doing here?" The question hit me like a slap, but I kept the smile frozen on my face. "The invitation," I said, reaching into my purse to pull out the cream linen card. "You invited me. 7 o'clock, it says." "I'm actually a few minutes early." She didn't take the invitation, she didn't even look at it. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder into the house, and I followed her gaze to see my father, Robert Bennett, holding court near the base of the grand staircase, a tumbler of bourbon in one hand, the other gesturing expansively as he told some story that had his audience rapt with attention. He was good at that, commanding a room, making people lean in to catch every word. He'd built an empire on that ability, turning inherited money into a real estate development company that had reshaped half of Savannah's skyline. There must have been some mistake, my mother said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. This was supposed to be immediate family only. I am immediate family, I said, and I hated how my voice wavered, how that old desperate need for acknowledgement crept in despite everything I'd learned over the years. I'm your daughter. Something flickered across her face. Pity maybe, or annoyance that I was making this difficult. Natalie, she said, and now her tone was firmer, more controlled. Jessica and Trevor organized this. It's their gift to us. They wanted it to be intimate, just us and a few very close friends. Jessica, of course. My sister, 3 years older, infinitely more successful at being exactly what our parents wanted. Jessica, who'd married Trevor Dalton, whose family owned half the historic properties downtown. Jessica, who'd given our parents 2 perfect grandchildren and a son-in-law who laughed at all of Robert Bennett's jokes and played golf at the club every Saturday morning. Jessica, who fit into the Bennett legacy, like she'd been custom designed for it. I have an invitation, I repeated, holding it up, my hand trembling now despite my best efforts to stay calm. Look, it has my name on it. You sent this to me. My mother finally looked at the card, really looked at it, and I saw something shift in her expression, confusion, maybe, or calculation. I don't know how you got that, she said carefully, but this evening isn't appropriate for you to attend. I'm sorry, but you'll need to leave. The words settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and absolute. Behind her someone laughed, a bright, carefree sound that belonged to people who knew they were welcome, who'd never stood on a doorstep being uninvited from their own family's celebration. I could see Jessica now, moving through the crowd in a ruby-red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, her blonde hair cascading over one shoulder, Trevor's hand possessive on her lower back. She caught sight of me through the doorway and stopped mid-sentence, her face registering surprise and then something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction. She came to the door, champagne flute in hand, perfect lipstick smile in place. Natalie, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, what a surprise. I didn't realize you'd be dropping by. I was invited, I said, looking directly at her. Someone sent me an invitation to Mom and Dad's anniversary dinner. Jessica's eyebrows lifted in an expression of exaggerated confusion. That's strange, she said, glancing at our mother. We specifically kept the guest list small, immediate family, and their closest friends. I don't recall adding your name to the list. Then who sent this? I demanded, thrusting the invitation toward her. She barely glanced at it. I have no idea, she said with a little shrug. Maybe someone was playing a prank.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Or maybe you misunderstood something. Either way, tonight really isn't a good time. We're trying to create a special evening for Mom and Dad, and having unexpected guests would just complicate things. Unexpected guests. That's what I was. Not a daughter, not a sister, an unexpected guest who complicated things by existing. I looked past them both, into the house where I'd spent 18 years of my life, where I'd learned to make myself smaller and quieter and less troublesome. My father had noticed the commotion now. He was making his way toward the door, his expression already hardening into that look I knew so well, the look that said he was about to handle a problem. What's going on here? He said, not asked. His voice carried the weight of authority he'd spent a lifetime cultivating. Natalie showed up, Jessica said before I could speak. Apparently she thinks she was invited. Robert Bennett looked at me the way he might look at a subordinate who'd made an error in a contract, with disappointment and barely concealed irritation. Natalie, he said, this is a private family event. Your sister and Trevor went to considerable trouble to arrange this evening. I don't know where you got the idea you were included, but this isn't the time or place for one of your scenes. one of my scenes. As if I was the one who created drama, as if I was the problem, not the family who'd spent my entire life making it clear I didn't quite measure up. I felt something inside me shift, something that had been bending for years suddenly going rigid. I didn't come to make a scene, I said, my voice steadier now. I came because I received an invitation, a formal invitation with my name on it, sent to my address, inviting me to celebrate your 35th wedding anniversary. If you didn't want me here, you shouldn't have invited me. I didn't invite you, my father said flatly. Neither did I, my mother added, her hand still on the door, like she was ready to close it at any moment. Jessica just smiled, that perfect smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Well, this is awkward, she said. Someone clearly made a mistake, but regardless, Natalie, tonight isn't about you, it's about Mom and Dad, and honestly having you here would just make everyone uncomfortable. You understand, don't you? I understood perfectly. I understood that they'd rather pretend I didn't exist than deal with the messy reality of a daughter who didn't fit their carefully constructed image. I understood that whatever had happened with that invitation, whether it was a genuine mistake or something more deliberate, they were united in their desire to see me gone. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I had spent 26 years hoping for something from these people that they could never give me. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 7 times, marking the official start of the celebration. Behind my family, guests were beginning to move toward what I assumed was the dining room, following the scent of expensive catering and the promise of an evening among Savannah's elite. Nobody was looking at the door anymore. Nobody cared about the girl standing on the threshold, holding an invitation that apparently didn't mean anything. Fine, I said quietly. I'll leave. Relief flooded my mother's face. Thank you for understanding, she said, already starting to close the door. But I'm keeping this, I added, holding up the invitation because someone sent it to me, and I want to know who and why. Jessica's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Does it really matter? She said. Just let it go, Natalie. Move on, as if it were that simple, as if I could just walk away from being erased from my own family's milestone celebration and pretend it didn't cut straight through to the bone. I looked at each of them in turn, my father already turning away, dismissing me as thoroughly as if I'd never existed. My mother, her hand on the door, ready to shut out the inconvenience of a daughter who'd never learned to be what they wanted. And Jessica, my sister, watching me with something in her eyes that might have been triumph, or might have been pity, or might have been both. I turned and walked back down the brick pathway, past the manicured gardens and the luxury cars, my heels clicking in rhythm with my heartbeat. Behind me, I heard the door close with a soft final click. The laughter inside grew louder, the party resuming now that the unpleasant interruption had been dealt with. Nobody came after me. Nobody called my name. Nobody suggested that maybe, possibly, this was wrong. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, staring at the invitation in my lap. The paper was real. The embossing was real. My name, written in my mother's handwriting, was real. This wasn't a delusion or a misunderstanding. Someone had sent this to me. Someone had wanted me to show up at that door tonight. The question was why, and the answer to that question, I was starting to realize, might be more important than I'd initially thought. I drove away from the Bennett estate as the sun set over Savannah, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were almost too beautiful for how I felt. My phone sat silent in the cup holder. No calls, no texts, no last-minute change of heart from anyone inside that house. The city passed by in a blur of historic homes and Spanish moss, tourists taking sunset photos on River Street, couples strolling hand in hand through squares that had witnessed centuries of Southern history. All of it felt distant, like I was watching life happen through a window I couldn't quite reach. By the time I pulled into the cramped parking lot behind my apartment building, darkness had settled over the city. My building was nothing like the Bennett estate. It was a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that was still waiting for gentrification to arrive, with thin walls and temperamental plumbing and a view of a parking lot rather than manicured gardens. But it was mine. I'd signed the lease myself, paid the deposit with money I'd earned, furnished it piece by piece from thrift stores and clearance sales. Nobody had given it to me. Nobody could take it away. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my studio apartment, the invitation still clutched in my hand like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite name. Inside, I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and stood in the middle of the small space, suddenly unsure what to do with myself. The evening stretched ahead, empty and accusing. I was supposed to be at a celebration. I was supposed to be surrounded by family, toasting to love and longevity, and all the things the Bennetts pretended to value. Instead, I was alone. My phone buzzed. Finally, I grabbed it, some stupid part of me still hoping it might be an apology, an explanation, something that would make sense of what had just happened. But it was just Amy, my friend from the community center where I volunteered. "Hey, how's the fancy family dinner going?" Her text read, "Are you surviving the Bennett charm offensive?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Didn't make it past the front door." Apparently I wasn't actually invited. The 3 dots appeared immediately, disappeared, appeared again. Amy was trying to figure out what to say, how to respond to something that was both absurd and entirely predictable if you knew my family. Finally, her response came through. "What do you mean you weren't invited? You showed me the invitation last week." "I know," I wrote back. "But according to them, there was some kind of mistake. Jessica organized it. Immediate family only. I don't qualify." Apparently, this time the response was immediate. "That's insane. You are immediate family. What is wrong with these people?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I'd been asking myself that same question for as long as I could remember, and I still didn't have a good answer. What was wrong with the Bennetts? Everything and nothing. They were successful, respected, admired by everyone who mattered in Savannah's social circles. They donated to the right causes, attended the right events, said the right things in public. On paper, they were the perfect family. It was only behind closed doors, only if you were unlucky enough to be the wrong kind of Bennett, that you saw the cracks, the coldness, the conditional love that evaporated the moment you failed to meet impossible standards, the way they could make you feel worthless with a look, insignificant with a word, erased with silence. I set the phone down and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot and the dark shapes of buildings beyond. Somewhere across the city, my family was sitting down to dinner. They were laughing, toasting, celebrating, and they were doing it without me, probably without even thinking about me, as if the scene at the door had already been forgotten. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't stop seeing my mother's face when she opened that door, the flash of something that might have been guilt, before the mask of social propriety slammed back into place. I couldn't stop hearing Jessica's voice, so sweet and so cruel. I couldn't stop feeling the weight of that closed door, the finality of it. Something was wrong. Something beyond the usual Bennett dysfunction. The invitation was real. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't misunderstood it. Someone had deliberately sent it to me, and then my entire family had closed ranks to keep me out. That wasn't just cruelty, that was strategy. I pulled out my laptop and opened it on the small dining table that doubled as my desk. If someone had wanted me at that door tonight, there had to be a reason, and if my family had united so quickly to turn me away, there had to be something they didn't want me to see. I started where I always started when I needed to understand the Bennetts. I pulled up the Bennett Real Estate Development Company website, scanning through the press releases and project announcements, new luxury condos on the riverfront, historic renovation of the old Cotton Exchange building, a mixed-use development in the Victorian district that promised to preserve history while creating modern amenities. All of it looked pristine, professional, exactly what you'd expect from one of Savannah's premier development firms. Then I opened a new tab and searched for the Bennett Foundation, the charitable organization my parents had established 15 years ago, ostensibly to give back to the community that had made their success possible. The website was equally polished. Photos of ribbon cuttings and check presentations, my parents smiling alongside local officials and nonprofit leaders, grants awarded to youth programs, historic preservation projects, arts initiatives. On the surface, it was a model of philanthropic responsibility, but I'd worked in the nonprofit sector long enough to know that surface impressions could hide a multitude of sins. I started digging deeper, pulling up tax filings and public records, cross-referencing board members and donation amounts. At first, everything looked legitimate, but the more I looked, the more I noticed small inconsistencies. Grants announced that didn't appear in the public filings, board members who shared addresses with Bennett Real Estate Properties, donation amounts that didn't quite add up. When you compared year-to-year reports, it wasn't damning, not yet, but it was interesting, and it made me wonder what else might be hiding beneath the Bennett family's carefully polished exterior. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Amy. It was a number I didn't recognize, local area code, but no name attached. I hesitated, then answered. Natalie Bennett, a woman's voice said, not a question, a statement. Yes, I said cautiously. Who is this? Someone who thinks you should know the truth about your family. There was a pause. The sound of traffic in the background. That invitation you received wasn't a mistake. My heart started pounding. Who is this? I repeated. Check your mailbox, the voice said. Tonight. Don't wait until morning. And Natalie, be careful. The Bennetts don't like loose ends. The line went dead. I sat frozen, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence where that stranger's voice had been moments before. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in, every shadow in the corner potentially hiding something I couldn't see. Check your mailbox. Tonight. Don't wait until morning. The words echoed in my head, half warning and half invitation to step into something I didn't fully understand yet. My mailbox was 3 floors down, in the narrow vestibule that smelled perpetually of mildew and old pizza boxes. I'd checked it that morning before work, pulling out the usual collection of credit card offers and grocery store circulars. There'd been nothing unusual then, but someone wanted me to check again now, at 9:30 on a Friday night, after I'd just been turned away from my own family's celebration. I grabbed my keys and headed downstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, despite the heels I was still wearing. The stairwell was dimly lit, one of the fluorescent tubes flickering in that irregular pattern that made everything feel vaguely ominous. I could hear televisions through apartment doors, someone's music thumping bass notes through the thin walls, the ordinary sounds of other people living their ordinary lives, while mine was tilting sideways into something I couldn't name yet. The vestibule was empty. Through the glass front door, I could see the parking lot, my Honda still sitting where I'd left it, streetlights casting orange pools of illumination across the cracked asphalt. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly like it always did, but my hands were shaking as I fit the small key into my mailbox lock. Inside was a manila envelope, unmarked, except for my apartment number written in block letters with black marker. No postage, no return address. Someone had hand-delivered this, slipped it through the slot, meant for mail carriers, wanted me to find it without any way to trace where it came from. I pulled it out and stood there in the flickering light, weighing it in my hands. It was thin, but not empty. Maybe a dozen pages inside, maybe more. Back in my apartment, I locked the door behind me and threw the deadbolt for good measure. Then I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope in front of me, like something that might explode if handled wrong.
Whatever was inside, someone thought I needed to see it badly enough to track down my address, to time their anonymous phone call precisely, to make sure I found this tonight specifically. That level of deliberation suggested the contents were either very important or very dangerous, and probably both. I opened the envelope carefully, tilting it to slide the contents onto the table without touching them more than necessary. A stack of papers emerged, photocopies mostly, some printed emails, a few photographs. I spread them out, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Financial records, bank statements with names I recognized, transfer receipts showing money moving between accounts, and at the center of it all, like a spider in a web, the Bennett Foundation. The first document was a bank statement for an account in the foundation's name, showing a balance of nearly $300,000. That wasn't unusual. Charitable foundations held money, distributed it according to their mission statements, maintained operating reserves, but someone had highlighted certain transactions in yellow, drawing my eye to patterns I might have otherwise missed. Regular transfers out of the foundation account, always in round numbers, always on the 15th of each month, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, all going to the same receiving account. I flipped to the next page, another bank statement, this one for an account belonging to Magnolia Properties LLC. I knew that name. It was one of the shell companies my father had set up years ago, supposedly to manage some of the rental properties in the Bennett real estate portfolio. But these transfers coming in didn't correspond to any rental income I'd ever heard about. They matched exactly, dollar for dollar, the transfers leaving the foundation account. Someone was funneling charitable donations through the foundation into a private business account. Someone was treating the foundation like a personal piggy bank, moving money that was supposed to help the community into pockets that were already deep with Bennett wealth. And based on the signature lines I could see on some of the transfer authorizations, that someone was my father, with Jessica's name appearing as a co-signer on most of the recent transactions. I kept reading, my stomach tightening with each page. Emails between Jessica and Trevor discussing property acquisitions, how the foundation could be leveraged to secure historic tax credits that would then be transferred to properties the family owned personally. Photographs of checks made out to the Bennett Foundation from local businesses, along with what looked like quid pro quo agreements. Donate $50,000 to the foundation, get priority consideration on the next commercial development project, contribute to the annual gala, receive favorable zoning recommendations from Robert Bennett's friends on the City Planning Commission. It was a scheme, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, turning charitable giving into a money laundering operation that enriched the family, while providing just enough legitimate grants to maintain the foundation's nonprofit status. And it had been going on for years, maybe since the foundation's inception, hidden behind the respectability of the Bennett name, and the assumption that people like my parents would never need to steal because they already had everything. The last item in the envelope was a handwritten note on plain white paper, the same block letter printing as my apartment number on the outside. They know someone's been asking questions. They think it's you. Be ready. No signature. No indication of who had compiled this evidence, or why they'd chosen to give it to me specifically. But the implication was clear. Someone inside the Bennett orbit knew about the fraud, and had been investigating it, and somehow, I was being positioned to take the fall. That's what tonight had been about. Not a mistake with the invitation. Not a simple case of my family's usual coldness. They'd wanted me to show up, to be seen trying to crash their celebration, to look desperate and unstable in front of witnesses. They were building a narrative, constructing a version of events where I was the problem child, the troubled daughter who might say anything for attention, so that when the fraud came to light, when investigations began and questions were asked, they could point to me as the source of malicious lies, the disgruntled family member with an axe to grind. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping loud against the floor. This was bigger than hurt feelings or family dysfunction. This was criminal, the kind of thing that could destroy reputations, end careers, send people to prison, and my family had decided that if anyone was going down for it, it would be me. The daughter they'd already written off, the one whose credibility they'd spent years systematically undermining, the perfect scapegoat. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I answered without thinking, still reeling from what I'd just read. "Did you get it?" the same woman's voice asked. "Yes," I said. "Who are you? Why are you giving this to me?" "Because someone needs to stop them," she said, And you're the only Bennett who might actually care more about doing the right thing than protecting the family name. How do you know that? I demanded. How do you know anything about me? There was a long pause. Let's just say I used to work for your family, she finally said. And I learned the hard way what happens to people who ask inconvenient questions. They ruin you, Natalie, systematically, efficiently, without mercy. If you're going to use what I gave you, you need to be smart about it, and you need to be ready for them to come at you with everything they have. What do you expect me to do with this? I asked, gesturing at the papers spread across my table even though she couldn't see them. Take it to the police, the media. I expect you to protect yourself, she said flatly. Make copies, store them somewhere safe, somewhere they can't disappear if something happens to you, and start documenting everything, every interaction with your family from now on, every phone call, every message, every time they try to contact you, because they will try, and they'll be building their case against you while pretending to be concerned family members reaching out to their troubled daughter. This is insane, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. This wasn't insane. This was calculated, sophisticated, exactly the kind of long game the Bennetts excelled at. They'd been playing chess while I'd been trying to figure out if I even belonged on the board. Welcome to reality, the woman said, and there was something like sympathy in her voice. I know it's a lot. I know you probably want to believe there's some explanation, some way this is all a misunderstanding. There isn't. Your father is stealing from a charitable organization he created specifically to enhance his reputation and provide tax benefits. Your sister is helping him do it. And now they're setting you up to be the villain in the story when it all falls apart. Why now? I asked. Why tonight? Why this week? What changed? Someone filed a complaint with the IRS, she said, 3 weeks ago. Anonymous tip about irregularities in the Bennett Foundation's financial reporting. The investigation hasn't started yet, probably won't for months given how backlogged federal agencies are, but your father has friends in places, people who give him advance warning about these things. He knows something's coming, and he's preparing his defense, which apparently includes sacrificing you. I closed my eyes, trying to process the enormity of what she was telling me. My family wasn't just excluding me from a party, they were framing me for fraud. They were so confident in their ability to control the narrative that they'd literally invited me to their celebration just to create evidence of my instability when they turned me away. What do? I asked quietly. First you survive, she said. Then, if you're brave enough, you fight back. But Natalie, you need to understand what you're up against. The Bennetts have money, influence, connections that go back generations in this city. They've donated to every politician, every judge, every person who matters. If you go up against them, you'll be fighting alone. I won't be alone, I said, looking at the papers on my table. I'll have the truth. She laughed, but it was bitter. The truth is just another story, Natalie, and they're much better at telling stories than you are. Think about it. Really think about whether you're ready for this, because once you start, there's no going back. You'll stop being a Bennett. You'll become the enemy. I'm already not a Bennett, I said. They made that clear tonight. No, she corrected. Tonight they made you think you're not a Bennett. There's a difference. Right now you're hurt and angry, but you're still bound to them by history, blood, and the part of you that keeps hoping they'll change. The moment you use what I gave you, that bond is severed permanently. You'll be choosing truth over family. Most people can't do that. I looked around my small apartment, at the life I'd built separate from Bennett money and influence. It wasn't much by their standards, but it was honest. I'd earned every piece of it, and maybe that's what she was counting on, whoever this anonymous benefactor was. Maybe she'd watched me long enough to know that I valued honesty over comfort, that I'd reached the point where I had nothing left to lose. I'll think about it, I told her. Don't think too long, she warned. The investigation might not start for months, but your family is moving faster than that. They're already controlling the narrative, already planting seeds about your mental state, your financial troubles, your jealousy of Jessica's success. I've heard it myself at the club, at fundraisers, little comments that seem concerned but actually paint you as unstable. By the time any official inquiry begins, everyone who matters will already believe you're capable of making false accusations out of spite. How do you know all this? I asked again. Because I've seen them do it before, she said simply. To me, when I started asking questions about where the foundation money was really going, I lost my job, my reputation, nearly lost my home. They're very good at destroying people, Natalie, don't underestimate that. Then why should I try? I said, feeling despair creep in at the edges. If they're that powerful, that ruthless, why would I put myself through that? Because maybe you're stronger than I was, she said, and because someone needs to stop them before they hurt more people, but mostly because I think you're tired of being the invisible daughter, the one they can dismiss and ignore and use when convenient. This is your chance to be seen, really seen, for who you actually are instead of who they've decided you should be. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my family's crimes, and the ruins of the last bit of hope I'd been carrying that somehow, someday, they might actually love me. The clock on my microwave said it was just past 10. At the Bennett estate, dinner would be wrapping up, guests moving to the terrace for after-dinner drinks and cigars, my parents basking in the glow of being celebrated by everyone who mattered in their world. I gathered up the papers carefully, separating them into two piles. One said I'd keep here, hidden somewhere they wouldn't think to look if they came searching. The other I'd take to a copy shop, first thing in the morning, make multiple sets, distribute them to safe locations. Then I pulled out my laptop again, and created a new folder, labeling it simply documentation. If they were going to paint me as unstable, I'd create a timeline so detailed, so thoroughly evidenced, that their story would crumble under scrutiny. I started with tonight, typing out everything that had happened from the moment I arrived at the estate to the moment I drove away, every word spoken, every expression on their faces, every detail I could remember. I attached a photo of the invitation, making sure the metadata showed when and where it had been mailed to me. Then I went back further, documenting instances over the past few months where my parents or Jessica had made odd comments, asked strange questions, seemed to be testing me or setting me up for something I didn't understand at the time. The pattern was there once I started looking for it. 3 months ago, Jessica had asked me about my work at the Homeless Advocacy Center, specifically whether I had access to donor lists and financial records. I'd thought it was just small talk. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to establish that I had knowledge of nonprofit financial management, building toward a narrative where I'd be believable as someone who could commit foundation fraud. 6 weeks ago, my mother had invited me to lunch, an unusual enough occurrence that I should have been suspicious. She'd spent the entire meal asking about my finances, whether I was struggling to make rent, whether I'd considered asking the family for help. I'd been too proud to admit how tight things were, but I'd also been touched that she seemed to care. Now I saw it differently. She'd been establishing my motive, creating evidence that I was desperate enough to steal. 2 weeks ago, my father had called, the first time he'd initiated contact in over a year. He'd wanted to know if I'd been in touch with any journalists, if anyone had been asking me questions about the family business. I'd said no, confused by the random question. He'd seemed relieved, then warned me that there were always people trying to dig up dirt on successful families, that I should be careful about who I talked to and what I said. At the time, I'd taken it as typical Bennett paranoia about their reputation. Now I understood he'd been checking whether I was the source of the IRS complaint, and when he'd determined I wasn't, he'd begun positioning me as the likely suspect anyway. They'd been planning this for months. I realized with cold clarity, maybe longer, this wasn't a panicked reaction to an investigation. This was a carefully orchestrated strategy, and I'd been too hurt by their usual rejection to see the larger game being played. Tonight's humiliation at the door hadn't been spontaneous cruelty, it had been theater, performed for an audience of witnesses who would later testify that Natalie Bennett had shown up uninvited, desperate for attention, clearly unbalanced. I kept typing, my fingers flying across the keyboard as years of confused hurt suddenly reorganized themselves into a pattern of deliberate manipulation. Every slight, every dismissal,
every moment where I'd felt like I was going crazy because my family's words didn't match their actions. They'd been gaslighting me for years, training everyone around them to see me as the problem so that when this moment came, when they needed someone to blame, I'd be the obvious choice. By the time I finally stopped, it was past 2 in the morning, my eyes burned from staring at the screen, my back ached from sitting hunched over the laptop, but I had 40 pages of documentation, cross-referenced with dates and witnesses, and supporting evidence. It wasn't enough to prove anything yet, but it was a start. It was my story, in my words, before they could bury it under their version of events. I saved multiple copies to different cloud services, emailed the file to myself at 3 different addresses, and finally allowed myself to feel the exhaustion that had been building all night. Tomorrow, I'd figure out the next steps. Tomorrow, I'd decide whether I was really brave enough to take on my entire family, to blow up the Bennett reputation, and probably my own life in the process. Tonight, I just needed to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around me, replaying that moment at the door over and over, my mother's face, Jessica's satisfied smile, my father's cold dismissal, the way they'd closed ranks so effortlessly, united in their determination to keep me out. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn a place in that family, trying to be good enough, trying to understand what I was doing wrong. And it turned out I'd been asking the wrong question all along. The question wasn't what was wrong with me, it was what was wrong with them. And now I had 40 pages of documentation, and a manila envelope full of evidence beginning to answer that question. The truth was ugly and complicated, and probably more painful than anything I'd experienced so far, but it was also solid ground, something real to stand on instead of the constantly shifting sands of Bennett approval that I'd been trying to build my life on. My phone lit up on the nightstand, another text message. I almost ignored it, assuming it was more communication from my mysterious benefactor, or possibly the beginning of my family's counterattack. But the name on the screen made me pick it up. Amy again, checking in after my earlier revelation about being turned away from the dinner. "You still up?" her message asked. "Want company?" I typed back yes, before I could think better of it, and 20 minutes later, she was at my door with a bottle of cheap wine and a box of grocery store cookies. We sat on my couch, and I told her everything. About the invitation that wasn't supposed to exist, about the manila envelope and the financial records, about the anonymous phone calls, and the realization that my family had been setting me up for months. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When I finished, she set down her wine glass very carefully. "Okay," she said, "first thing tomorrow, we're going to see Karen Reynolds at the legal aid office. She handles non-profit fraud cases, and she's tough as hell. Second, you're going to let me make copies of everything, and I'm keeping a set at my place where your family can't get to them. Third, you need to stop thinking of these people as your family, they're criminals who happen to share your DNA, there's a difference." "I know," I said, but my voice cracked on the words, because knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two very different things. Part of me still wanted to believe there was some explanation, some way this could all be a misunderstanding, even though the evidence was overwhelming and the pattern was clear. That little girl who'd spent her whole life hoping for Bennett approval was dying hard. Amy reached over and took my hand. "You're going to get through this," she said firmly. "And when it's over, you're going to have something they never will. You're going to have integrity and self-respect, and the knowledge that you did the right thing even when it was hard. That's worth more than all the Bennett money in the world." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that integrity and self-respect would be enough, that doing the right thing would feel like victory instead of devastation. But right now, sitting in my small apartment with evidence of my family's crimes spread across the table, all I felt was tired and sad and scared of what came next. The wine helped a little, the cookies helped more. And having Amy there, solid and supportive and completely on my side, helped most of all.
By the time she left around 4 in the morning, I felt marginally more capable of facing whatever tomorrow would bring. I had a plan now, or at least the beginning of one. Document everything, make copies, find a lawyer, protect myself first, then decide whether I was ready to go on the offensive. I finally fell asleep as the sun was starting to lighten the sky, and I dreamed of locked doors and invitations written in disappearing ink, and my mother's face when she told me I didn't belong. But I also dreamed of standing up straight, of speaking truth even when my voice shook, of walking away from that closed door with my head held high, and when I woke up a few hours later, that image stayed with me, the girl who walked away, the woman who refused to be erased. Maybe that's who I needed to become, maybe that's who I'd been trying to be all along, and the Bennetts had sensed it and tried to crush it before I fully understood my own strength. They'd underestimated me, dismissed me as too quiet, too compliant, too desperate for their approval to ever pose a real threat. That had been their mistake, and I was starting to think it might be the mistake that finally brought them down. The morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through my curtains like an accusation. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of actual sleep, the rest spent in that twilight state where you're not quite awake but not resting either, your mind churning through scenarios and conversations that haven't happened yet. My face felt puffy, my eyes scratchy with exhaustion, but when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I didn't see the broken girl I'd expected. I saw someone who looked tired, yes, but also determined, resolved, like something fundamental had shifted overnight. I made coffee strong enough to strip paint, then sat back at my kitchen table with the financial documents spread out again in the harsh light of day. Last night they'd seemed overwhelming, damning, almost surreal in their implications. This morning they just looked like evidence. Numbers on pages, transfers between accounts, signatures that could be verified, patterns that could be traced. The emotional weight was still there, the knowledge that these papers represented my family's willingness to commit fraud and frame me for it. But the shock had worn off enough that I could think strategically instead of just reactively. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure the images were clear and legible, then uploaded them to 3 different cloud storage accounts, with passwords I'd never used before. Then I carefully returned the originals to the manila envelope and tucked it into a shoebox in the back of my closet, underneath winter sweaters I wouldn't need for months. It wasn't a sophisticated hiding place, but it would do until I could get to a bank and rent a safety deposit box. The thought that I needed to hide evidence from my own family, that they might actually break into my apartment looking for these documents, should have seemed paranoid. Instead, it felt like basic common sense. Amy texted at 8:30, earlier than I'd expected, given how late she'd stayed. "I'm outside, bringing breakfast. Don't argue." I buzzed her up, grateful beyond words for a friend who knew exactly what I needed without having to be asked. She arrived with a bag of bagels from the place on the corner, and 2 large coffees, her hair still damp from the shower, and her expression all business. "Eat first," she said, unpacking the bag on my counter. "Then we strategize. Karen Reynolds opens her office at 9, and I want us there by 9:15, before she gets booked up with other cases. I already called and told her we were coming, that it was urgent. She'll see us." I bit into a bagel I didn't really want, my stomach still twisted from the previous night's revelations, but Amy was right that I needed fuel for what was coming. We ate quickly, mostly in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that only happens between people who've known each other long enough that every moment doesn't need to be filled with words. Amy had been my friend since college, one of the few relationships I'd maintained that had nothing to do with the Bennett name or influence. She worked as a social worker for the county, dealt with dysfunction and family trauma professionally, and had never once been impressed by my last name or the stories about Bennett wealth and prestige.
She'd seen through the polished exterior from the beginning, recognized the loneliness underneath, and had appointed herself my advocate without ever making it feel like pity. We drove to the legal aid office in her car, a practical sedan that smelled faintly of the lavender air freshener she kept clipped to the vent. The office was in a converted house in the Victorian district, one of those grand old places that had been chopped up into rental units and professional spaces, its former glory visible in the ornate woodwork and high ceilings, but faded now, practical rather than beautiful. The sign outside read Community Legal Services in simple black letters, and the front door stuck a little when Amy pushed it open, swollen from humidity and years of use. Inside, the reception area was cramped but clean, filled with mismatched furniture and walls covered in posters about tenant rights and domestic violence resources. A young man sat behind the desk, typing on a computer that looked like it might have been cutting edge around the time I was born. Amy gave him her name, mentioned Karen Reynolds, and he nodded toward a hallway. "Second door on the left, she's expecting you." Karen Reynolds was nothing like the lawyers I'd grown up around, the ones who wore $1,000 suits and practiced in glass towers downtown. She was maybe 50, with steel gray hair cut short and practical, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her office was small and cluttered, every surface covered with case files and legal books, but her desk was clear except for a yellow legal pad and a mug of tea that steamed gently in the morning air. "Amy Chen called me about you," she said without preamble, gesturing for us to sit in the two chairs across from her desk. "She said you've uncovered evidence of non-profit fraud involving your family. That's a serious allegation. Before we go any further, I need to know if you're prepared for what making that allegation means. Legally, personally, emotionally, because once we start down this road, there's no easy way back." I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken that morning, then handed it to her without comment. She scrolled through slowly, her expression never changing, but I watched her eyes narrow slightly as she recognized what she was seeing. When she finished, she set the phone down carefully and looked at me with new assessment. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "Someone delivered them to my apartment last night," I said, anonymously. "I don't know who, but they also called to warn me that my family is setting me up to take the fall when the IRS investigation starts. Apparently someone already filed a complaint 3 weeks ago." Karen picked up a pen and started making notes on her legal pad. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning, don't leave anything out, even if it seems irrelevant or embarrassing. I need the full picture if I'm going to help you." So I told her. I started with growing up in the Bennett house, the golden child versus scapegoat dynamic, the way I'd always been made to feel like I didn't quite measure up. I told her about Jessica and Trevor, about my father's real estate empire and my mother's social ambitions. I described the Bennett Foundation, its stated mission and public reputation, and then the growing suspicions I'd had over the years that something wasn't quite right about how the money flowed. I walked her through the invitation that had arrived in my mailbox, the humiliation at my parents' door, the realization that the whole thing had been staged to create witnesses to my supposed instability. Karen listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her face impassive but her attention complete. When I finally finished, my throat raw from talking, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Okay," she said. "First, the good news. What you've been given is extremely valuable. These financial records, if they're authentic, show a clear pattern of self-dealing and misappropriation of charitable funds. That's federal fraud, and it's the kind of thing the IRS and State Attorney General's office take very seriously. The emails and photos provide context and intent. You've essentially been handed a roadmap of criminal activity, and the bad news," I said, because there was always bad news. "The bad news is that your family is doing exactly what I would do if I were trying to preemptively discredit a whistleblower."
They're establishing a narrative where you're unstable, financially desperate, jealous of your sister, prone to making false accusations. If you come forward with these allegations, they'll argue you fabricated the evidence out of spite. They'll question your mental state, your motives, your credibility, and given that you received these documents anonymously from an unknown source, they'll have some legitimate grounds to question authenticity. So what do? I asked, feeling that familiar helplessness creeping back in. You do what they don't expect. Karen said, you don't go public. Not yet. First we build your defense, we document every interaction with your family from this point forward, we gather independent evidence that corroborates what's in these financial records, we find the person who gave you this information and convince them to go on record, we make you bulletproof, so that when they come after you, and they will, we're ready. How long will that take? I asked. Weeks, possibly months, she said honestly, this is a marathon, not a sprint. But here's what we can do immediately. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the IRS on your behalf, not as an anonymous tip, but as a concerned citizen with specific evidence of fraud. That creates a paper trail and establishes you as someone trying to work within the system, rather than someone making wild accusations. Then we're going to request a restraining order if your family attempts to contact you in any way that could be construed as harassment or intimidation. Will that work? Amy asked. The Bennetts have a lot of influence in this city. Karen smiled, and it wasn't a particularly warm expression. So do I. She said, just different circles. I've been handling nonprofit fraud and abuse cases for 20 years. I know the federal prosecutors, the IRS investigators, the state AG's staff, and unlike your family's lawyers, I don't care about preserving anyone's reputation. I care about stopping people from stealing money that's supposed to help the community. That's a kind of influence, too. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, the first real hope I'd had since opening that manila envelope. What do you need from me? I asked. Everything you've got, she said. All the documentation, all the photos, any communication with your family going forward. I also need you to write out a detailed statement about your relationship with your family, focusing specifically on the past 6 months and any instances where they might have been building this narrative about your instability. And I need you to think hard about who might have given you these documents. Someone on the inside, someone with access to financial records and email systems. We need to find them and convince them to cooperate officially. What about the foundation itself? I asked. Should I be looking for more evidence there? Absolutely not, Karen said firmly. You go anywhere near the foundation offices or records, and they'll accuse you of theft or breaking and entering. Everything we do has to be completely above board, completely legal. We're not trying to match their tactics. We're trying to expose them using the system they think they're too powerful to be touched by. That means patience and precision. We spent another hour going over details, Karen asking questions I hadn't thought of, pointing out holes in the timeline that needed to be filled, explaining the legal process that would unfold once we filed the formal complaint. By the time we left her office, I had a 3-page list of tasks and homework, but I also had a plan. More importantly, I had an advocate who believed me, who wasn't intimidated by the Bennett name, who saw this as winnable rather than hopeless. Amy drove us to the copy shop next, where we made multiple sets of every document, storing them in separate locations. One set went into a safety deposit box at a bank across town, the kind of place the Bennetts would never think to look. Another set went to Amy's apartment, hidden in her storage unit in the building's basement. A third set stayed with me, but in a new hiding place, tucked inside an old textbook on my bookshelf, where no one would think to look unless they were literally searching every item in my apartment. It was almost noon by the time we finished,
And I was running on coffee and adrenaline, and the strange clarity that comes from having a concrete plan instead of just spinning in circles of anxiety. Amy suggested lunch, but I wasn't hungry. What I needed was to be alone for a while, to process everything that had happened in the past 18 hours, to let myself feel the full weight of what I'd just committed to doing. She dropped me back at my apartment, making me promise to call if I needed anything, if my family tried to contact me, if I felt overwhelmed or scared or like backing out. I promised, meaning it, then climbed the 3 flights to my door and let myself into the quiet of my small space. The coffee cups from that morning were still on the counter, the bagel bag crumpled beside them, evidence of normal morning routine, breakfast with a friend, ordinary life, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. I spent the afternoon working on the statement Karen had requested, trying to capture years of subtle manipulation in concrete, documented incidents. It was harder than I'd expected, not because I couldn't remember examples, but because writing them down forced me to confront just how extensive the gaslighting had been. Moments I'd dismissed as my own oversensitivity or misunderstanding revealed themselves as calculated moves in a long game I hadn't known I was playing. Like the time 2 years ago when I'd suggested to my father that the foundation should publish more detailed financial reports, make transparency a selling point to potential donors. He'd looked at me like I was being naive, told me that wealthy donors didn't actually care about that level of detail, they just wanted the tax deduction and the social recognition. When I'd persisted, pointing out that other foundations did it and it enhanced their credibility, he'd gotten cold. "You don't understand how this world works, Natalie. Maybe when you've actually accomplished something significant, you'll have earned the right to offer opinions on how to run a successful organization." The conversation had ended there, and I'd felt appropriately chastened, like I'd overstepped my place. Now I saw it differently. I'd gotten too close to something he wanted to keep hidden, and he'd shut me down using shame and condescension, making it about my inadequacy rather than his secrecy. How many other conversations had followed that same pattern? How many times had I been made to feel stupid or naive for asking perfectly reasonable questions that would have exposed problems they didn't want examined? I wrote it all down, incident after incident, creating a timeline of manipulation that stretched back years. By the time I finished, I had 12 pages single-spaced, and my hands were shaking from the anger that had built with each paragraph. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, sustained kind that hardens into resolve. They'd done this deliberately, systematically for years, and they'd assumed I was too weak, too desperate for their approval, too conditioned to their control to ever fight back. That had been their second mistake, I thought. The first was committing fraud in the first place. The second was underestimating me. My phone buzzed, and I almost ignored it, deep in my work and not ready to resurface yet. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw my mother's name, and my stomach dropped. This was it, the beginning of their counterattack, the concerned parent reaching out to the troubled daughter. I let it go to voicemail, watching the notification appear, then played it back with my own phone on speaker so I could record it with my laptop's microphone. Karen had said to document everything, and I was learning to be thorough. "Natalie," my mother's voice said, and she sounded worried, almost convincing. "Your father and I are very concerned about last night. Showing up uninvited like that, making a scene at our celebration. We're wondering if you might be going through something, if maybe you need help. Please call me back. We want to support you, sweetheart. We're family, and family takes care of each other." The word sweetheart landed like a slap. She'd never called me that, not once, in 26 years. This was performance, creating a record of the concerned mother reaching out to her unstable daughter, offering help that I would presumably reject, further proof of my irrationality. I saved the recording, backed it up to the cloud, Then added a note to my statement documenting the call, the timeline, the fact that they'd never once in the past expressed concern about my well-being, but were suddenly very interested in my mental state, right after I'd been given evidence of their crimes. Another text came through, this time from Jessica, "We need to talk. It's important. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow?" I stared at that message for a long time, imagining what that coffee meeting would look like. Jessica would be warm, sisterly, concerned. She'd ask probing questions about my life, my finances, my emotional state. She'd probably suggest therapy, offer to help pay for it, create more evidence of the family's supportive attempts to help their troubled relative. Every word would be carefully chosen, every gesture calculated to build their narrative while seeming like genuine care. I didn't respond to either message, following Karen's advice to maintain distance, to force them to escalate if they wanted contact. Let them get frustrated. Let them show their hand. Every communication they sent just added to my documentation, and their silence would be just as telling as their words. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of writing and revising, cross-referencing my statement with the financial documents, looking for connections and patterns. I was so focused that I didn't notice the sun setting until my apartment had grown dim and I had to turn on lights. My back ached from sitting hunched over the laptop, my eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I had something now, 20 pages of detailed testimony, supported by financial records and recorded communications, a comprehensive picture of fraud and framing that was beginning to look like the kind of case even the Bennetts would have trouble dismissing. I emailed everything to Karen, then forced myself to step away from the work, to eat something approximating dinner, to try to pretend for a few hours that my life hadn't just become a legal battle against my own family. I put on a movie I'd seen a dozen times before, something that required no thought or emotional investment, and let it play while I sat on my couch staring at nothing, my mind still churning through implications and consequences. The anonymous benefactor hadn't called back. I wondered about that, about who they were and what they wanted from me. They'd said they used to work for my family, that they'd been destroyed when they asked inconvenient questions, that suggested someone from the foundation staff, or maybe the real estate company, someone close enough to access financial records but not family, not protected by the Bennett name. Someone who'd been watching me, judging whether I was worth the risk of making an ally. I pulled up the Bennett Foundation website and navigated to the staff page, looking at the photos and brief biographies of the people who supposedly ran the day-to-day operations. Executive Director Marcus Bellamy, who'd been with the foundation since its inception. Program Manager Diane Chao, 5 years with the organization. Development Coordinator Kenneth Marsh, 3 years. Administrative Assistant Sylvie Porter, 2 years. Any of them could have access to financial records. Any of them could have seen something that didn't add up and started asking questions, but which one had been brave enough or angry enough to become a whistleblower? And how could I find them without tipping off my family that I was looking? That was a problem for tomorrow. I decided. Tonight I just needed to survive, to get through the first full day of knowing the truth without falling apart or second-guessing the decision to fight back. Tomorrow I could strategize about tracking down my mysterious ally. Tomorrow I could worry about next steps and legal filings, and whatever moves the Bennetts made in response to my silence. Tonight I just needed to prove to myself that I was strong enough to do this. My phone buzzed again around 10. Another call from my mother that I let go to voicemail, another message that I recorded and saved, then a text from my father, brief and businesslike. "Your mother is worried, stop being childish and call her back. We need to discuss what happened last night." The shift in tone was telling, from concerned parent to demanding authority figure, frustrated that I wasn't playing my assigned role in their drama. I turned off my phone after that, plugged it in across the room where I couldn't compulsively check for new messages, and forced myself to go through the motions of preparing for bed. Brush teeth, wash face, change into pajamas,
Normal nighttime routine, as if anything about this situation was normal, but the rituals helped, gave structure to time that might otherwise have spiraled into anxiety and second-guessing. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around me, thinking about the girl I'd been yesterday morning versus the woman I was becoming. Yesterday I'd been hurt, confused, still hoping for some version of family reconciliation that would never come. Today I was a whistleblower in the making, someone with evidence and legal representation, and a plan to bring down the people who'd raised me. The transformation should have felt more dramatic, should have been marked by some moment of clear decision. Instead, it had been gradual, a series of small steps that added up to a completely different trajectory for my life. Tomorrow I'd file the formal complaint with the IRS. Tomorrow, Karen would start the process of building an airtight case. Tomorrow I'd continue documenting every attempt my family made to contact me, every move they made to control the narrative. Tomorrow I'd start the work of tracking down whoever had given me those documents, of convincing them to go public with what they knew. But tonight, I just needed to sleep, to rest before the real battle began, because I was under no illusions about what was coming. The Bennetts would fight with everything they had, would use every resource and connection and manipulation tactic in their considerable arsenal. They would try to destroy me systematically, efficiently, the way they destroyed everyone who threatened their carefully constructed world, and I needed to be ready for that. Needed to be stronger than I'd ever been, needed to believe that truth and integrity were worth the cost even when the price felt impossibly high. I thought about that moment at the door last night, my mother's face when she told me I wasn't invited, the casual cruelty of it. That version of Natalie Bennett would have apologized, would have left quietly, would have spent weeks or months wondering what she'd done wrong to deserve such treatment. But that girl was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that the question had always been wrong. Not what was wrong with me, but what was wrong with them. And armed with that understanding, with evidence and allies and determination, maybe I had a chance at winning this impossible fight, or maybe I'd lose everything. Maybe they really were too powerful, too connected, too skilled at controlling narratives and crushing opposition. Maybe in 6 months, I'd be the one without a reputation, without credibility, without anything but the cold comfort of having tried to do the right thing. But even that, I thought as sleep finally began to pull me under, even that would be better than spending the rest of my life as their scapegoat, their invisible daughter, the Bennett they could erase whenever it was convenient. At least this way, whatever happened, I'd be fighting on my own terms, for my own truth, as my own person. The IRS complaint went out Monday morning, filed electronically through Karen's office, with every piece of documentation we'd compiled attached as exhibits. There was no going back after that, no pretending this was still a private family matter that could be quietly resolved. The moment we hit send, I became an official whistleblower, someone who'd reported her own family for federal crimes. The weight of that settled over me like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable, but underneath it was something else, relief maybe, or purpose. The sense that I'd finally stopped being carried along by other people's currents, and had chosen my own direction, regardless of where it led. Karen had warned me that the federal bureaucracy moved slowly, that it could be months before an actual investigation began, but that the complaint itself would trigger certain protocols. The IRS would acknowledge receipt, would assign a case number, would begin preliminary review of the evidence, and somewhere in that process, they'd notify the parties involved that allegations had been made. That notification, when it came, would be the spark that ignited everything my family had been preparing for. They'd know then that someone had come forward officially, and they'd know from the specificity of the evidence exactly who that someone had to be. I spent Monday and Tuesday in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal life, while waiting for the inevitable explosion. I went to work at the Homeless Advocacy Center, where I volunteered 3 days a week,
helped people fill out housing applications, and navigate social services, tried to focus on other people's problems instead of my own. My coworkers noticed something was off, asked if I was feeling okay, commented that I seemed distracted. I blamed it on not sleeping well, which was true enough. The nightmares had started, variations on the same theme of being chased through the Bennett estate while doors slammed shut in front of me, and my family's laughter echoed from rooms I could never quite reach. Amy checked in twice a day, making sure I was eating and sleeping, and not spiraling into panic. She'd become my lifeline without either of us explicitly acknowledging it, the one person I could be completely honest with about how terrified I was underneath the determination. Because I was terrified, not of the legal process, or even of losing the case. I was terrified of that final severing of family bonds, of becoming truly and completely alone, in a way I'd never been before. Even when the Bennetts had excluded me, ignored me, dismissed me, I'd still technically belong to them. After this, I'd belong to no one but myself. That freedom came with a vertigo I hadn't anticipated. Wednesday morning, my mother showed up at my apartment. I'd just gotten out of the shower, was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe with wet hair when I heard the knock. I looked through the peephole, and there she was, Patricia Bennett in perfectly tailored slacks and a silk blouse, looking like she'd stepped out of a country club luncheon. For a moment I just stood there, heart pounding, unsure what to do. Karen had said to document all contact, but avoid direct confrontation, but my mother was at my door, and ignoring her felt impossible. I opened it with the chain still on. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She looked at me through the gap, and something flickered across her face that might have been genuine emotion, or might have been excellent acting. I couldn't tell anymore. "May I come in?" she asked. "We need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "Please, Natalie, just 5 minutes. I'm worried about you." The worried mother routine again, but this time delivered in person, where it would be harder to dismiss. I thought about what Karen would say, about maintaining boundaries and not being drawn into conversations that could be used against me later. But I also thought about the fact that my phone was recording in my pocket, that any conversation we had would be documented whether Patricia Bennett knew it or not. I closed the door to unhook the chain, then opened it fully. 5 minutes, I said. She came in, glancing around my small space with an expression I couldn't quite read. She'd never been to my apartment before, had never expressed any interest in seeing how I live separate from the Bennett world. Now she took in the thrift store furniture, the makeshift desk made from a door, and filing cabinets, the general air of making do with limited resources. I watched her register all of it, calculate what it meant about my financial situation, file it away for whatever argument she'd come to make. "You could have so much more than this," she said finally, not sitting even though I gestured toward the couch. "Your father would give you a position at the company tomorrow if you asked. A real salary, benefits, a future. You don't have to live like this." "I like my life," I said, which wasn't entirely true, but was true enough in the ways that mattered. She turned to face me directly, and her expression hardened into something more honest than the concerned mother mask. "This is about last Friday, isn't it? You're punishing us for not letting you crash the anniversary dinner." "I wasn't crashing anything," I said evenly. "I was invited." "No one invited you, Natalie. Jessica organized everything, and she would have told me if she'd added your name to the list. You need to let this go." This obsession with being included in every family event, this constant need for attention, it's becoming concerning. "I received a formal invitation in the mail," I said, "with my name on it, in your handwriting." "That's impossible," she said, but I caught the briefest hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty. "If someone sent you something, it wasn't from me. Maybe you made it yourself. It wouldn't be the first time you've done something desperate for attention." That landed exactly as she'd intended it, a reminder of some incident from my teenage years that I'd spent decades trying to live down, when I'd faked sick to get out of a family obligation and been caught. She'd never let me forget it, had referenced it over the years whenever she wanted to question my version of events. You have a history of deception, Natalie. We all remember that. I'm done with this conversation, I said quietly. You need to leave. Not until you promise me you'll stop spreading lies about this family, she said, and now the concerned mother act was completely gone, replaced by something much colder. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but it ends now. Do you understand me? I opened the door holding it while I waited for her to leave. She didn't move for a long moment, trying to stare me down the way she had when I was young and powerless. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and eventually she seemed to register that something fundamental had changed. She walked past me without another word, her shoulder deliberately bumping mine as she went, a petty gesture of aggression that would have devastated me a week ago. Now it just felt pathetic. I closed the door behind her and locked it, then immediately saved the recording to multiple backup locations before my hands started shaking. That had been a test. I realized they'd sent my mother to gauge my resolve, to see if I could be intimidated or manipulated back into silence, and I'd passed or failed, depending on whose perspective you took. Either way, they knew now that I wasn't going to back down quietly. Thursday, the phone calls started in earnest, my father leaving increasingly angry voicemails about family loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. Jessica, alternating between fake concern and thinly veiled threats. Even Trevor got involved, sending texts about how disappointed he was in my behavior, how I was destroying something precious for attention. I didn't respond to any of it, just documented everything, added each communication to the growing file Karen was building. Friday morning, Karen called with news. The IRS had acknowledged the complaint and assigned an investigator. It was happening faster than she'd expected, which suggested that my evidence had been compelling enough to warrant immediate attention. But she'd also heard through her contacts that the Bennetts had hired Whitmore and Associates, one of the most aggressive defense firms in the Southeast. They were preparing to fight, and they were bringing serious legal firepower to the battle. That means they're scared, Karen said. They wouldn't be spending that kind of money if they thought your allegations were baseless. They're trying to bury this before it gains traction, which actually works in our favor. Desperate people make mistakes. I wanted to feel encouraged by that, but mostly I just felt exhausted. It had been a week since the anniversary dinner, 7 days since my world had turned inside out, and I was already tired of fighting. The Bennetts had decades of practice at this kind of warfare, at using money and influence and sheer relentlessness to crush opposition. I had righteous anger and a legal aid attorney and evidence that might or might not be enough. The odds didn't feel particularly favorable. That afternoon, Amy convinced me to leave my apartment for a few hours, to stop obsessively checking my phone and documents and just exist in the world as a normal person for a little while. We went to Forsyth Park and walked among the tourists and locals, past the famous fountain and the wide expanses of lawn where people were having picnics and playing with dogs. It was one of those perfect Savannah days, warm but not hot, the air soft with the promise of spring just a few weeks away. Everything looked peaceful, beautiful, completely at odds with the chaos consuming my life. You know they're going to come after you hard, Amy said as we walked. Not just legally, they'll try to destroy you socially, professionally, personally. That's what powerful people do when they're threatened. I know, I said, and you're really ready for that, to lose everything for the principle of the thing? I thought about that question seriously, turning it over in my mind while we walked. Was I ready? Could anyone ever really be ready to blow up their entire existence for an abstract concept like justice? But then I thought about those financial documents, about all the money that was supposed to help people who actually needed it being funneled into Bennett pockets instead. I thought about whoever had given me that evidence, someone who'd already paid the price for trying to expose the truth,
And I thought about the girl I'd been a week ago, still desperate for scraps of Bennett approval, still willing to make myself smaller and quieter to earn love that would never come. I don't know if I'm ready, I admitted, but I'm doing it anyway, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life as their scapegoat, and I can't do that anymore. I won't. Amy nodded, satisfied with that answer. Then we'll figure it out together, she said.